For those of you that don't know me, I'm Geoff Wilkinson. I'm Managing Director of Wilkinson Construction Consultants. We're licensed approved inspectors. We've been going for 10 years now, and we've grown from essentially just me to a team of over 12, thanks in no part to being a member of Urbano. No, they've really helped us in our networking over the course of the years. What I'm going to do today is to run through briefly, give you some background to the whole reason why we've got to where we've got to, look at the current Part L in part, what the future of Part L is, and because I'm a really, really fantastic guy, I'm going to give you some bonus stuff as well that wasn't included in the stuff that was advertised, not least because that's what's in my slides and not what was originally planned, but that's a complete aside. So whenever I do these, I always like to start from the basis of what the hell is regulation about? Why are we doing regulation? To me, regulation is there essentially because society won't do the stuff that society needs to do, so therefore we have to have an impact on society to make it do the right thing. Why is that relevant? Well, even if we go way back, I'm going to go back even further than the 1960s. My history lesson goes way back. Mine goes back to the Bible. If you look in Deuteronomy, it says within there one of the very first aspects of building regulations. When you build a new house, you must ensure that you put railings around the top of the house, particularly if it's a flat roof, so that if anyone were to fall off, you won't be considered to be guilty of murder. Now, I always think that if you can go home at the end of the day after you've done your first day's work and you've not been found guilty of murder, that's probably a fairly successful baseline to start from. And if we work up from there, we can move on from that. Just to put that into some kind of context where we are, within the past few days, the European Parliament has declared a climate emergency. That is how serious the situation actually is. We are talking about the potential loss of people's lives. So whilst I'm slightly flippant about using the biblical analogy there, actually this could be something of biblical proportions, and we really need to start getting our heads around that and starting to do something about it. So that brings us to the Future Homes Consultation. This is a document which is out and has been published and is there for consultation, and this sets out the current proposed trajectory towards getting to the point of zero carbon and what we're going to be doing about it. But before we go there, I'm going to give you another bit of history. The regulation of energy use in buildings is nothing new. We've been doing this since the 1960s. In fact, if you go back into the early 1970s, you'll remember, at least a few of you in this room will remember, the fuel crisis that we had at the time, where you basically couldn't get petrol. You were queuing back down the streets. That was the first point at which we saw the need to introduce regulations on energy use. And as a part of that, we started to implement building regulations to ensure that we met our needs. And that involved energy conservation within buildings. It wasn't really, though, until the 1980s that you started to see some real movement in terms of the building regulations, and that was the point at which we started to see the introduction of Part L in that time. It was very early days in 1985 when Part L first came out. Didn't really progress much for a decade until 1995. And when it was updated. And in 2002, we started to move away from energy efficiency into the concept of CO2 and emissions. So we started to rethink what it was that we were actually trying to achieve. By 2002, the approved document was then split, and we started to consider both domestic buildings and non-domestic buildings. By 2003, we'd had the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. Now, this was EU legislation which set out the move towards getting to the point of zero carbon. In 2006, Part L underwent a revolution. Out went the elemental method, and in came a new piece of black box technology where you took not just the thermal performance of the elements of the building, but you started to look at the overall performance of that building. And we set out an agenda back then, under Gordon Brown, to move towards zero carbon homes. We had a plan that by 2016, we'd already be starting to build these. Without getting overly political, which is difficult for me, we then had the implementation of a coalition government. And with that coalition government came about a whole series of new agendas. The government came in with a view that regulation must be effective and should be as light touch as possible. In fact, and several times, they referred to it as a bonfire of the regulation. They were looking to, on every occasion possible, to at least get out one regulation for every new regulation that they brought in. So they were very much a deregulation-based government. In fact, as that progressed, it got to the point where for every regulation that they brought in, they wanted to get 2 out, and so it continued. In 2013, the government was still confirming its commitment to the zero carbon homes agenda, but it did so rather uniquely in the budget. Which is interesting, because all of a sudden it was the Treasury and not the Environment Department, or whatever we want to call them, that were actually setting the agenda going forwards. So despite the fact that Europe at that point was requiring zero energy buildings from 2019, this position was actually set out in the building regulations. So we had a trajectory from 2013 to 2019 that would be delivering zero carbon buildings as we speak today. And that was going to have a step phase. So 2013 we had one increment, and 2016 we had a further increment. When it eventually came forward, the 2013 change actually came about in 2014. And when it came in, it was a much watered down version even then. So instead of having a 25% increase, we ended up with just a 6% improvement. The standards that were brought in also for commercial buildings were just 9% across the build. What also happened was that something called the transitional provisions were implemented. Now what that meant was that if you had a building where you applied before that date, you could continue to comply with the regulations before that date. So even though the build would actually be delivering 3, 6, 5 months further on, 9 months further on, 3 years further on, you could still get away with having submitted your application before the new regulations, and that meant you could build out-of-date buildings as far as that was concerned. The 2013 brought in a new concept, a new elemental recipe, and you had far more black box technology as well. What was interesting was that it was doing nothing in terms of consequential improvements for existing building stock. Now, why is that important? It's important because the vast majority of the emissions that we get from this country are not from the stuff that we are building as of today. It's coming from the buildings that we have got up that are already standing as of today. So unless we tackle the existing building stock, we are not going to succeed in reducing our emissions in any way, shape or form. Along then came the housing review, and the housing review did away with, amongst other things, for the Code for Sustainable Homes. And in particular, it talked about the problems that they were experiencing with planning authorities implementing higher standards of energy efficiency that were inappropriate to developments. So what happened was all of the regulations in and around energy efficiency were taken from multiple documents and were stuck down into effectively 3 little blocks. So you had the things that the planners could do, the things that building control could do, and then a set of separate technical standards. One of the other things that's important within this is understanding what we're talking about when we talk about zero carbon. One of the things that Mark was sort of hinting at is that when we talk about zero carbon, we're talking about effectively net zero carbon in the building, so that the energy use within the building is effectively offset in some way, because it's almost impossible to build a true zero carbon building. Somewhere along the line, you're going to have to do something to offset it, and there is effectively a triangle of that. So you end up with a base build at the bottom, which is all the things you can do about energy efficiency within the structure of the building. Then you have on top of that your services and what you can do to make those as efficient as possible, and then there is still likely to be a bit at the top of the triangle that you're going to have to offset in some other way. And as I say, when we actually look at this, you can see this was the trajectory as we were proposing. So we should have been, by 2016, starting to build all of these wonderful zero carbon buildings so that we'd start transforming the building stock. But if you look at it, you can see that the vast majority of those are still way back in the pre-2010 situation. A number have come in post-2010. We haven't had any real movement on the 2016 regulations because they didn't come in. Why didn't they come in? Because the Treasury, in a document called Fixing the Foundations, basically did away with the 2016 change. So in the 2016 change, we could have had a 40% improvement on our existing building stock, but we didn't. The government chose to delay that because they were so concerned about the effect it would have on house building, and the government are so determined that they must be building houses because that is their key point in their agenda. So that brings me to the bit that you've actually come along for, which is the current housing standards review itself. Now this is focusing on both energy efficiency and ventilation requirements of the building regulations. The energy efficiency and ventilation requirements in relation to dwellings as things stand at the moment. We are only dealing with dwellings at this point in time. There will be a future consultation that deals with buildings that are non-dwellings. On the 27th of June this year, the UK became the first economy in the world to pass a net zero emissions target into law, which is something that I will actually commend the government about doing. This target will require that the UK brings in or brings down gas emissions to net zero by 2050. Even under the Gordon Brown regime, it was only effectively 80% reduction from the 1990 target level. So this is a really significant move forward, and it is something which is really positive. But how is that going to be delivered? What we need to bear in mind is that the new homes that we're constructing over the next 5 to 10 years will be some of those homes that exist in 2050. So we must start to make that change now. Alongside the various pledges that are being made left, right and centre at the moment by all of the parties out there on their environmental credentials, the thing that's actually going to deliver this will be the building regulations, no matter how they attempt to go about any of the other commitments that they're making. And that will be delivered through Part L of the building regulations. So that's the bit that needs to be changed. So when you go to the consultation document, you can take a look and you can see all of the things that are actually being proposed to be changed. There is a draft version of the new approved document L, and the key elements that are changing are the ones highlighted in yellow. So I've stripped a page out and I've indicated for you some of the things that are changing. On that particular page, that's everything. So what are we actually doing? We're taking primary energy now as the principal performance metric, as opposed to CO2 as the primary performance metric. Now what this means is we're starting to look at how affordable the actual requirements are actually going to be in the future. We are removing the fabric energy efficiency metric, which seems really counterintuitive, but we're changing the way in which we're actually looking at the calculation overall. We're also changing the requirements to Part F, which relates to ventilation of the building. the requirements for airtightness, and we're also improving the issue about compliance of the building fabric itself and how that is going to be delivered and how that is actually going to be inspected. So the future home standard will still require very high standards of fabric compliance. It will mean that every new home effectively will need to have triple glazing and the highest practical standards for walls, floors and roofs to ensure that we get as little heat loss through those as possible.
Geoff, I take it fabric means the stuff that goes...
Sorry,
it's not the cloth that you stick on your ground.
No, it's not. No, sorry. When we're talking fabric here, we're talking the building fabric, which is the brick walls, it's the roof, it's the floor. And by reducing the demand for heat, we will also move forwards. Now, what does this mean in practical terms? It means in practical terms, we've got to move away from providing boilers in buildings. So our traditional gas boiler is effectively going to be redundant over the course of the next 5 to 10 years as we start to develop these out. So this is going to be one of the key changes that you're actually going to see. So you're going to see the installation of heat pumps or district heat networks as being the core way in which you get buildings to comply under the new regulations. So as you can see from the wonderful slide that DCLG themselves have produced, the idea is that we take things off of the national gas grid work and we start to use renewables, we start to use sustainable methods in order to provide that. Now, these come with some costs. So let me just run you through as they stand at the moment. The proposal at the moment is that in 2020, that's next year, there'll be a 20% improvement on the Part L 2013 requirements, which essentially is just what we originally said we would be doing back in 2016. Alternatively, there's an option in the consultation for a 30% improvement and the introduction of requirements for on-site renewables. And by the time we get to 2025, the idea will be that we will have completely phased out the requirement for fossil fuel supply to our new buildings. As I say, these come with costs. So the suggestion as it stands at the moment is that if we start with the base version, you're going to be looking at something like a capital cost increase of £2,500. And if we go for the 30% increase, you're going to be looking at about £4,500 to £5,000 increase in costs. However, these will be offset in part by the operational costs of the building as you go forwards. So there will be a payback over a period of time for this. Some of you will really be interested in the fabric requirements, which mean the U values of the various bits and pieces, the walls, the roofs, etc. One of the interesting things about the discussion is that the Part L 2020 suggestion for option 2 actually maintains a number of the existing U values that you've already got. Because one of the things that we've discovered is that there is a very low rate of return on increasing the thickness of walls and insulation. There's only so far that you can practically go with it. Otherwise you end up with walls that are 5 foot thick in order to get to the point that you're going to get any further improvement in the heat loss through it. So there's only so far that you can actually go with that. So, as I've said, what we're looking to do is to ensure that primary energy will become the new performance metric, and alongside that, heat affordability will be introduced into the new guidance documents themselves. The fabric efficiency will improve, and alongside that, you've got the airtightness requirements. Now, for those of you that are not used to the details of how this all works, the more airtight the building is, the less heat is lost as a result of it. The problem with that is that the less air that's circulating around in the building, the less air there is to breathe, and the more noxious that air becomes over a period of time. So what the new guidance is going to do is it's going to divide it down into naturally ventilated buildings and mechanically ventilated buildings. Some of the guidance that already exists about passive ventilation has actually been removed from this guidance document. There is also going to be increased guidance on the ingress of external pollutants into the building. So that's both air going out and guidance about noxious stuff coming in. So what are we looking to do? We're looking to ensure that all buildings have this airtightness test, that the requirement will be that the airtightness requirement will drop from the current 10 air changes in effect down to 5 and lower beyond that. As a result of that, we need to ensure that the ventilation requirements are upped to match that, to ensure that the air that you breathe within those buildings is accurate. There will also be something called a pulse test, which will be the new way in which you actually test the building to ensure that you're getting the air tightness requirements that are necessary. There is a wonderful new piece of black box technology. So the information that comes out of that document will be reduced in something called a BRIEL, which is the document that you see in front of yourself, which is the way in which the information that you put in will be spat out for you to send into building control. But perhaps one of the most important parts to this is about ensuring the information flow and that what is designed is actually delivered on site, because that's one of the major aspects that we've got as an issue. Going forward, there is going to be an additional requirement for photographic evidence of the installation actually in place, being submitted to building control, being sent through to the person who actually performs the calculation, and being on record for the homeowner. Why is this important? It's important because at the moment, what often happens is that the insulation in buildings is covered up without anyone actually seeing it. The builder will make a self-declaration of what was put in, including all of the energy performance of boilers and any other heating, the controls, the pipework insulation, etc. that's gone into the building. So they will have self-declared that. That self-declared information gets passed on to the EPC assessor. They produce a calculation and they produce a energy performance certificate for that building, and that is what you believe you are actually buying. The truth is that that does not necessarily represent the energy performance of that house in any name, way, shape or form. So what we're going to have to do is to ensure that as a contractor, you're producing much, much better records of what you actually put in and how it was detailed. Another interesting aspect to this is that at the moment, the planning department drive a lot of the sustainable construction issues. As a result of these changes, it will no longer be relevant for planning permissions to deal with energy efficiency as part of that planning consent. It will be solely down to building control and the building regulations to deliver on that. So the Planning and Energy Act 2008 will be looked at, and they will be removing the ability of local authorities to put in requirements for energy efficiency in planning consents going forwards. Now, I mentioned that one of the issues with previous regulations was the ability of a contractor to put in an application for 2,000 housing units today, avoid the need to comply with the current standard or the future standards, and then build those houses out over a period of, say, 7 years. Under the proposed transitional arrangements, it will be for each individual building. So if that individual building hasn't started on site, that building will have to comply with the regulations in place at the date the individual building has started. And that is one of the ways in which the government are looking to tackle the issue of contractors effectively banking up approvals on a number of these buildings. What else is the government proposing to do?
Excuse me, may I just interrupt very quickly?
Yeah, go on.
On that, this question of banking, is that already happening?
Is that already happening?
Yeah.
This proposal will ensure that when the new regulations come in, they will apply to any building that hasn't actually commenced yet.
The point I'm making is that are developers banking planning approvals currently?
Okay, so the issue of banking the planning approval is a separate issue to what we're talking about, compliance with these standards. The new standard will apply to any building that hasn't commenced. So regardless of that, so that's what the change is actually being brought in to address, because builders have been banking their building control and planning approvals. Okay, and providing you'd started on one individual plot on that site, you could then build out the remainder to that standard. This proposal will be that the new regulations will apply unless you have started on that individual building. Okay. There's a second consultation proposed on new non-domestic buildings. There is a proposal on works to existing buildings. Is anyone aware of the regulations that we actually have in Wales at the moment, in terms of building regulations? No. Okay, so in Wales they have a variation on what we have in England. They have something called consequential improvements for domestic buildings. So if, for example, you were building a small domestic extension on the back of your house, it is a requirement that whilst you're investing 20, 30, 40,000 pounds in that you ring fence some of that money to provide thermal improvements to your existing dwelling. So for example, and the most typical one that you would have in there is that as part of the kitchen extension, you would put in a new boiler, which is more efficient than your existing boiler. It would require that you consider lagging your pipework and putting, say, an extra 100mm of insulation in your loft. So there is a requirement that you effectively ring fence an amount of the money that you are spending on upgrading your building to put into thermal upgrades of your building. That is one of the things that we had considered and dropped in 2016 as part of the coalition. It is possible, we're still waiting for it to be published, it's possible that that will be back on the agenda again for England. It is also a requirement similarly for non-domestic existing buildings. So if you are going to be carrying out works on your offices, on your shops or any other building, the requirement is likely to say, as part of this, if you are spending £100,000 fitting out this building, why are you not spending some of that on energy efficiency measures as you go forwards? There is also an issue about overheating in new dwellings, in particular, which I will deal with separately. So for those of you that are interested within the Future Homes Standard consultation, it is currently live. There is a link on there that you can go along to. You can see all of the relevant documentation, and you have until the 10th of January. So whilst you're sitting there chomping on your turkey over Christmas, what better to do as a way of avoiding the in-laws than to have a copy of the Future Home Standard consultation in front of you. No one's going to bother you, you'll get peace and quiet, and you can complete this all-important task. But as I said, although that's what I was asked to speak about, I'm going to give you more because I'm that kind of guy. So alongside that, if you are interested in housing standards, there has also been a consultation on Part M, disabled access into buildings. So what will that be covering? It will be covering at the moment a proposal to up the base standard of access from what is called M41 to M42, which means that our houses will need to have more accessible features to them. So our current base level standard will drop, and the +1 standard, as it is at the moment, will then become the requirement, which will mean things like, at the very minimum, your staircases are designed so that you can fit a stair lift to them in future. Those are the kind of things that will become a requirement. That there is provision for the ground floor WC area to be converted to a shower for a disabled person, even if it's not currently the case. So those are the kind of things that are going to be kicking forwards. There is another consultation that finished in October, and this will require electric vehicle charging points to all new housing developments. Now this is again another really important measure going forwards, because one of the major problems for the uptake of electric vehicles is the lack of charging points. So by providing a building regs requirement that all new housing developments have these, it will improve the ability of people to actually start taking these on. And it's worth remembering that around another 20% of all emissions are coming from vehicles as they stand at the moment. The bit that I really want to try and get home to people, and which is just very loosely mentioned in the consultation itself, is this. It's the research that has been going on into overheating in our homes. Since 2015, 4 years ago, the government have known that there is a significant issue with overheating in our homes. Every year, as things stand at the moment, there are around 2,000 deaths due to overheating in our homes. As the climate increases in temperature, that is going to get worse. The projection is that there will be 7,000 people a year dying due to overheating in our homes. As we make them more energy efficient, as we make them more airtight, we need to be very wary of what that will do to the people that actually occupy it. So there is a separate consultation going out at the moment on that. This is particularly relevant to single aspect south-facing flats, as a for example. A lot of new dwellings at the moment are being produced by virtue of converting offices into flats. Now, a number of these have therefore only got windows on one side of the flat. It is a relatively small, highly energy efficient unit, but you're getting an enormous amount of heat gain during the day as a result of that. And there is real concerns that people are dying as a result of some of these design issues. So we're looking at aspects such as solar shading to see what we can do to actually reduce that effect down, and also about the rather counter-intuitive suggestion that will increase the requirements for air conditioning in these buildings, which will effectively make it really, really difficult to get south-facing single aspect dwellings through as we progress forwards. This is also going to present a real challenge as we move forwards. I don't know if you can see the top slide there, but basically it's the typical way in which the UK homeowner will purchase their building work, from a sign stuck to a railing outside a pub. Good builders, cheap rates, ring me on 079. We cannot continue to build in the way in which we currently build. We need to change the skill set of the construction industry. It's going to mean things like insulated concrete formwork, as a for example. It's going to mean major changes in the way in which we develop, whether it's off-site or whatever else. So there are some real challenges in actually bringing up our workforce to be able to deliver on these low carbon promises that we're making. To give you an idea of some of the challenges that we face, this is typically what an architect will have designed. So you can see a nice full fill cavity, you can see the insulation in place, you can see that there's no risk of thermal transfer from the front to the back, what we refer to as cold bridging. This is the kind of crap we see on site on a daily basis. There is no resemblance between that, and yet that is what we are facing. So unless we end up with a massive number of inspectors out there to try and check that these things are actually done properly, we do really need to challenge the way in which we're going forwards. So the photographic records will be a great way of doing that, but we'll need things like technology to ensure that when you're providing a piece of insulation, that you scan the barcode of that piece of insulation, you GPS position that, and you take a photo to show that it's installed. So there's a lot of technology that's going to be required for the workforce to understand how we can start to deliver and close the performance gap. But I'm going to close with perhaps the most important. I've spoken about a whole series of things that this country has had to face. But I think this is perhaps the most important, and this is the one that we've actually got parliamentary time sorted out. It's the issue of the low-level letterbox. Posties across this country have been suffering for many years from bad backs. So the government have introduced, and I shit you not, a requirement that the low-level letterbox is banned. There will be a building regulation. We've not done an enormous amount about Grenfell Tower, but we've got a building regulation that's going to require letterboxes to be between 900 and 1500 so that the posties don't have to bend down to put letters through, which is really important, particularly at this festive time of year, as the number of letters that they're having to deliver has increased dramatically. For those of you that have been, I thank you very much for listening. I've been Geoff Wilkinson, thank you.
It strikes me that if we're going to get anywhere near achieving net zero carbon by 2050, that we're moving to passive house, aren't we, really?
My view, yes.
Do you think that's a good thing?
Yes.
Good.
You didn't mention passive house.
I didn't because it's not included.
But the inference is.
Yeah.
Because that's one thing I put down.
Yeah, so personally...
Does everyone know what passive house is?
No.
We kind of do, don't we? But we don't. You want to explain what passive house is? 10 slides of the
in short, there are differing standards. There is a standard that's used across a large proportion of Europe, Scandinavia, etc., that utilises what's called passive house technology. Essentially, that's a highly insulated structural box that needs virtually no heating to it whatsoever. So it has lots of thermal mass, it collects the heat within the thermal mass during the course of the day and helps to release that back through. It is really, really highly energy efficient, but it is a completely different standard to anything that we're talking about here. And there are other standards out there as well, because passive house is actually a product, so we just need to bear that in mind. So there are other ways in which you can actually conform, and there are better ways, in my opinion, of doing it than we're talking about. And to be a true passive house, you should be fully certified throughout the whole of the process, and you would get a document at the end that says you are a certified passive house. There are still relatively low numbers of buildings in the UK that comply with that, as opposed to the fact that it's pretty much the standard across the whole of Europe.
Andy from Omniform.
What does Omniform do?
Design build. In terms of thermal bridges, how's Parnell dealing with that in terms of robustness and calculating them?
The principle, I mean, the concepts of the thermal performance through a thermal bridge have been previously established. We've got the guidance and the robust details that are in place at the moment. The principal issue that this version is dealing with is the fact that people don't actually build to those, that they're not actually complying with the standards that are in place and the guidance that's in place. Hence the reason why the discussion is about photographic records, detailing, etc. So thermal transmission through those bridges, we've already pretty much solved the issue of, providing we actually follow the guidance that's there. There is a lot of very technical discussion in the approved document about the metrics that you use in order to calculate them. I am not going to, in front of this audience or any other audience if I can, go into the detail of that, because it is incredibly boring unless you are a scientist.
Side values and all that?
Yeah. So I'm really not going to go into lander and side values and all the rest of it. It's not the audience for that.
Should we go over to the legal corner? You must be licking your lips at thinking, wow, that's planning and building regs separated. Lots of cases for us to get involved with. How do you view these proposed changes in terms of property and legal stuff?
We should. I don't see any issue.
No? You don't, I mean, in terms of, well, what's your company?
Greenwood's Gerald.
So you do property and that sort of stuff.
Residential,
So
yes.
how much work is taken up with sort of planning and building regs on behalf of developers? Is it a litigious area, or just, like Geoff said, a lot of stuff's just ignored, but now it's going to be get a focus on it?
Well, we don't get involved in obtaining EPCs. We just ask for them to provide it,
All right.
the documents.
But
From-
now that
from
that
the developers.
EPC element's going to be critical, then it seems.
It is becoming particularly important because as we move forwards, one of the drivers, for example, will be, I'm not sure if the audience is already aware of this or not, but there is already a driver that you cannot let a building that has a lower EPC level effectively than an E at the moment. So you're having to drive up that, and that will be one of the ways in which we deal with this in future. Because what you can do is, in the same way, effectively, when you've got a fridge, it's rated A to E. Okay. One of the ways in which you can start to deal with this is say that you cannot sell anything that's got worse than a D rating. Then you can turn around and say you cannot sell anything that's less than a C rating. Then you can say less than a B rating, then an A, then an A plus, then an A plus plus, etc. So one of the ways in which we can tackle this without going into the detailed regulatory bit is actually to simply make a requirement that you cannot sell or resell a building unless it achieves a minimum EPC rating. But it's vital that EPC rating is actually worth the paper it's written on. And particularly with existing buildings, the problem with that is that a lot of it is based on a presumption of what that building is based on the age of the building. So there is a lot of desk study type EPCs which bear little relevance to the building itself. And that's why also a lot of the buildings that we're talking about are buildings that are typically occupied by the less wealthy as well. Within that, the issue of fuel poverty and the affordability of these buildings becomes even greater. One of the other issues is that when you are on benefits, etc., the probability of you accessing the cheapest fuel becomes harder. So not only have you got a building which is more leaky that you can do nothing about because you're not the owner of the building, you can't actually improve or upgrade even if you had the money, you're actually paying for that energy at a higher rate than anybody else in the room is actually paying. So you are hit by a double or treble whammy on it. So you've got fuel poverty, you've got energy poverty, and you've also got the risk of potentially being overheated by the huge piece of glass that's catching the sun during the course of the day. So we really, really have to look at the issues as a whole and not just in isolation. And trying to drive up standards is vital within that. And simple things like ensuring that they meet a minimum level of A to E is got to be a better way than having detailed conversations about individual thermal bridges on a piece of construction detailing.
So, Ruby Winspear from Travers and Hamlins, and what we particularly, or what my team advises on is heat networks and developments. And what we're finding with this consultation as well is a lot of, so some of the developers are kind of working on smaller schemes that have heat networks, they're continuing as normal, but with developers that are working on multi-phase projects, they're quite nervous now about future-proofing because even though the first phases may not be caught by the building regs, they're worried about what second, the third, or fourth will happen. So again, I think it's quite an interesting thing. And they're talking about moving to heat pumps and hybrid systems.
And they're going to have these conversations. And as I say, the point is that it's too late to stop. You should have been doing this 4 years ago. Right? I mean, if you're a developer or anybody else, we already had this on the agenda, and yet we delayed it. And we cannot afford to delay it again and again and again. Genuinely, we are in an environmental crisis. We have to start doing it, we have to start doing it now. Going back to my original point about regulation. Regulation is there to make you do the things that you don't want to do. For God's sakes, don't wait for the regulations. Do the thing that you're supposed to do and do it now. That way it will result in something for our future generations, for our children and for our grandchildren, because if we don't, we won't have a planet afterwards.
When this consultation finishes in January, when is the actual regulation change due to come in?
So the next phase of it will come in sometime in 2020. Okay, and then the actual change, the core change, the bit that we're talking about, the Future Home Standard itself, is actually 2025.
So anyone building up to 20,
there are already a whole series of get-outs between now and 2025 for people that are building in that kind of period. Don't do that. Do not do that. If you have the option to start upgrading. Again, I often use the analogy of the MOT. Legally, you could design a car today and put it on the road from the showroom with 3 millimetres of tread on its tyre, because that would pass the MOT. You don't, as a manufacturer, do that. You innovate, you create, you make the car as safe as you possibly can. So you put in anti-lock brakes, you put in collision detection, you put in airbags, you do everything you can to make that car as safe as possible. Why, as a construction industry, do we consistently think, what's the minimum in the building regs, let's build to that? In fact, not only will we build to the minimum, we'll also try and do everything we can to try and go below the minimum. So if there's a way in which, well, that's the minimum tomorrow, but if I get in today, I don't have to do that. What kind of mindset are we working on in the construction industry compared with any other industry? And it's not surprising then why the housing industry has such a bad reputation, because that's what we do across the board, and that's what's got to change.